First You Think is a not-for-profit ministry of the First Unitarian Church of Des Moines. Support us at ucdsm.org today.
Good morning. My name is Aaron Rosenfeld. I use he and they pronouns. I'd like to present a plea for radical grace. This is really a plea I am making to myself, and I hope all of you can take something away from it as well. I'm going to start by presenting a selective and, frankly, kind of unpleasant autobiography. From a very early age, I could not help but notice how different I was from all the other kids. Or, to be more specific, from all the other Jewish kids I associated with under my upbringing. I was already set apart from the majority of society as is. At recess, while the other kids naturally formed little groups and started talking, I mostly minded my own business. I wasn't specifically preoccupied with anything else, mind you. I was just flummoxed by the state of affairs and how these kids went about it. It seemed automatic to them, but not to me. I don't think this specifically distressed me at first, but it did in due time. At the age of 6, I learned the word frustrated, and I identified with it. Hard. Memories are a bit too fuzzy to isolate specifics, but I know that I felt some deep internal tension woven into the normal social and educational rhythms of kindergarten. I did not enjoy and was not motivated by the same things as these other kids. When I became fascinated by a thing, I became preoccupied and often overwhelmed by it. By grade school, I started having tantrums. One of the worst that I can recall was in 2nd grade when I scored a 98% on a test because I forgot to fill in one question. I begged and pleaded with the teacher. It seemed so unfair. I knew the answer. I just missed it. My teacher was flummoxed by the intensity of my reaction, but obstinate not to change it. I broke down crying for a very long time, and when I finally stopped crying, I had an involuntary sniffle that persisted for hours, which I was told was very disruptive to the class. By 4th grade, the other kids realized that my tendency towards tantrums could be exploited towards hilarious effect. This is when things got particularly miserable for me. Before, my sense of alienation felt a bit more incidental, but now it was deeply pointed. When I came to my parents with these issues, their response was always the same. Just ignore it, often delivered with a deep sense of exasperation, as if this was both obvious and easy. But I couldn't ignore it. That was not how my mind worked, and being told to do so only deepened my sense of helplessness and frustration. It's at this point I should note where I attended school. At the time, it was called the Hebrew Academy of Indianapolis, but was renamed on its 25th anniversary to the Haston Hebrew Academy of Indianapolis. Not by coincidence. This is my mother's maiden name. My grandfather and great-uncle founded the school to promote Jewish education. I mention this because I suspect my teachers and school administration might have been a bit bolder about pursuing interventions if they didn't feel like their employment was on the line because they might embarrass my family with me. By 6th grade, I remember one of my Judaica teachers, Rabbi Levy, telling me that if I were his kid, he would have pulled me out of that school by then. I was also never really capable of interacting with the religiosity I was raised with in a way that did not feel like self-harm, with all the superlatives that it was laden with. When I was younger, I attended a Jewish day camp in Indianapolis. It was staffed by Lubavitch teenage girls. I mention Lubavitch because that's a specific set of Hasidic Jews who have a very specific zeal for the Messiah, who may or may not be their deceased spiritual leader, Menachem Mendel Schneerson. So, it could be called a cult. These girls would start every day having us scream songs about how badly we wanted the Mashiach. So naturally, I followed their lead so hard that I developed screamer's nodules, which is a vocal injury typically seen in professional singers. So I got speech therapy, which, to be fair, might contribute to my mellifluous diction to this day. When I turned bar mitzvah, that's actually a thing that happens passively under Jewish law, I started putting on tefillin in the morning. Tefillin, which are sometimes referred to as phylacteries, are a pair of boxes connected to leather straps, each containing scrolls of parchment within them. The shel rosh, the one that goes on the head, is straightforward to don. You just do this and you do this. The shel yad, the one that goes on the arm, requires a specific technique for wrapping, which varies by specific religious tradition. You wrap it around 7 times around your forearm, and then additional wrappings around the hand. But when I put mine on, I could not help but wrap it too tight. My arm would turn purple over the course of the prayer service. Sometimes my hand would even turn white. I remember people around me telling me not to go so tight, but the intensity of the ritual, of all the divine obligation that it carried, made it impossible for me to be merciful to myself. So I want to note here, my entire identity was framed about Orthodox Judaism. I had to do these things. I was a bad person if I didn't. I was constantly being judged by God, with my fate being judged anew every Rosh Hashanah and sealed anew every Yom Kippur. By the time I was 14, I was sent to yeshiva, a religious boarding school for Orthodox boys. I skipped 8th grade to get out of the academy, specifically because things had gotten so bad for me there. It turns out that the boys at the yeshiva could be just as mean, and now I had to live with them. By the end of my sophomore year, I was hospitalized with ulcers and enterocolitis. After the hospital, I found a new and intense edge to my foul disposition. I was sent to adolescent medicine specialists who, despite lacking any cultural literacy for what I was going through, were quick to diagnose me with depression and throw a pill at me. When they followed up, I was disheveled, struggling with deep philosophical questions associated with taking a pill to improve something that I perceived as an innate moral quality, and neither trusting nor open to these clinicians. So, of course, the diagnosis was that I was psychotic. Another pill. These meds in particular might have done some permanent damage to me. I already struggle with anhedonia, which is diminished ability to experience pleasurable sensation. And these medications, dopamine antagonists, which is what antipsychotics are, pharmacologically actually make this worse. My parents ended pulling me out of yeshiva and put me into public high school, which my father considered a last resort because, quote, they'd take anyone with a pulse. I was pleasantly surprised at being treated considerably better by the diversity of kids at public school than I ever had been elsewhere. During these years, I was continuously at odds with my parents, who were unequipped for even the mildest teenage rebellion. My father fixated on sternly telling me that I wasn't functional. When I was 15, he called me a shadow of my former self, which is not a lot of thing to have shadow for. My mother was perpetually indignant and judgmental. Within a few years, I gained enough independence and enough perspective to be willing to break away from orthodoxy. It was killing me. And so the only resolution was to amputate that part of myself. Even liberated, I failed to find my place in the world, to connect with others, or to even complete schooling or hold down a job. I was still suffering intensely from crushing emotional pain and dysfunction, and it bled out into all domains of my life. I started college but dropped out quickly. I worked terrible food service jobs and performed them poorly. I tried being a paramedic, I suppose, because it was an avenue towards going into medicine like my father that seemed attainable, but I was wildly unsuited to that profession on a fundamental dispositional level. I was, thankfully enough, still being supported that things never got too desperate financially, and I frequently think about what that signifies for others in an analogous position to mine who are less fortunate along those lines. I kept going back to psychiatrists and therapists, desperate to find some sort of help that would enable me to become independent, to stop experiencing such deep emotional turmoil, and to stop being so lonely. Many therapists and dozens of medications later, in addition to 2 forms of ketamine, RTMS, and about 36 sessions of ECT later, it's safe to say that psychiatry and the mental health industry, more broadly, lacked the requisite tools to help me. Until my late 20s, I assumed that I just needed to get an accurate diagnosis. Doctors were all over the map with me. After being diagnosed with schizotypal personality disorder and subsequently disowning that diagnosis, I started to realize that there probably wasn't going to be a correct diagnosis. And here, I want to take a little moment and let everyone sit with this phrase: personality disorder. If this isn't stigma, I don't know what is. I see it as an affront to human dignity. Now, I know there are members of our congregation that work in the mental health field. I don't want to be unduly harsh, but I do need to speak to my lived experience and what I have heard of others. There is the simple truth that some people struggle with issues that these professions, as of yet, lack the means to meaningfully understand or describe, much less address. It's also true that just by default, every mental health professional has at their side at all times a little button that locates the onus of a patient's pain onto the patient. Now, there are many contexts where it's healthy and valid to challenge a person to take ownership and responsibility of certain things in their life, to cultivate healthier attitudes and habits, etc., etc. But there are other contexts where that button is pressed to avoid dealing with difficult questions and to ease the clinician's own sense of helplessness. That is my lived experience of this matter. To my thinking, having a diagnostic category of personality disorder feels like putting a paperweight on that button and leaving it there. Naturally, this button gets pushed more with people whose distress is shaped by racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and of course, good old-fashioned poverty. So I have to wonder again, if things went the way they did for someone like me, how badly are they going for others with similar internal struggles? Until quite recently, I used the label mentally ill to describe myself, even though I couldn't really elaborate on the descriptor. Mood disorder was about as specific as I could get. In recent years, I've seen the term neurodivergent become increasingly common. I've historically bristled at it for a few reasons. Firstly, neuro implies a level of scientific understanding regarding our intrinsic differences that, after a great deal of research, I do not believe exists yet. More importantly, though, I think the need to recognize that some of us experience the world in radically different ways should not be contingent upon neuro anything. I understand that the imprimatur of scientific legitimacy carries weight, and I hold no ill will to those who take comfort from it for themselves or who would seek to wield that imprimatur as a shield. The definition of neurodivergent is a bit of a moving target. I'm not an expert on it. I'm not even fully in community with those who identify with it yet. And I'm not claiming specific authority beyond my observations. But at a high level, the most common definition is based on a specific cluster of psychiatric diagnoses, autism, ADHD, and learning disorders being the biggest ones. The broader significance of the term, though, I think is a recognition of people that have significant differences in cognitive functioning, how they think, affect, so patterns of speech, facial expression, posture, social and emotional processing, sensory perception, and executive functioning, which is loosely getting your stuff together. That last one is why I ended up revising this very reflection and was writing this sentence at 4 a.m. last night. But despite the messiness, despite my nitpicking, I have found value in identifying as neurodivergent. The superficial, obvious benefit has been the simple social cachet of being afforded a wider berth by identifying as such. Not to excuse any bad behavior, mind you, but just to contextualize my numerous idiosyncrasies in a way that people might tolerate, if not fully understand. Furthermore, I do think it's been beneficial to recognize that alongside my struggles are a set of gifts, both due to innate aptitudes from these differences and due to the skills I've had to cultivate to make my way through the world with them. Simply framing differences as having both upsides and downsides has allowed me to start excavating pieces of myself that I buried to fit in. But perhaps more importantly, allowing myself this label created a deeper shift in me. So earlier I mentioned that I had my intellectually valid objections to this term, but there was something a little more profound holding me back. And this is where I circle back to my call for radical grace. I often felt frustration and resentment towards others who present with these traits I saw in myself. The low self-esteem and self-hatred I felt over all these years naturally worked its way out of my body onto others. I saw patterns in the others that I had worked hard to hide or compensate for, and I judged. I saw people in situations that I myself constantly feared being in, and so I feared them. I even deigned to presume that others simply didn't have it as bad as me. Love that phrase. As I've warmed up to having language that puts me in community with others, I became much more attuned to the internal struggles of the people around me, around the right people, and in the right contexts. My armor came down, and things that had previously bothered me started to make sense through a different light. A tic or a stilted affect no longer annoyed me. When I saw people being brusque or prickly, I stopped centering my own indignation and became curious about what they were dealing with. If I recognized myself in someone who was clumsy or long-winded or a bit too discursive to be lucid, I found a generous reserve of patience. Rather than trying to identify some narcissism of small differences, some way in which my struggle has been different, I am growing, still, to identify points of kinship and familiarity. And in doing so, I am finding greater acceptance of myself. Thank you.